Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Chichek Bibi. I am a postdoctoral fellow here at Joukowsky, and I am chairing our last session on diversity today. And I will be introducing our speakers. We have two speakers in this session, and once again, we don't have Q&A in between, but we will have a big discussion at the end. First speaker is Ileana Micarelli. She is the Marie Sklodowska-Curie European Fellow in the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at University of Cambridge. She has a master's in bioarchaeology and master's of science in medieval archaeology, and she earned her PhD at the Department of Classics and Environmental Biology in Sapienza, University of Rome. Over the last 2 years, she has been the assistant researcher at the Department of Environmental Biology, researching bioarchaeology, paleopathology, and focusing on themes related to bioarchaeology of care and disability. She has been involved in numerous archaeological campaigns ranging from Roman to medieval ages, from Europe to Africa, and during her present project, she is specializing in archaeological theory related to disability and care in past populations. Please join me in welcoming Ileana.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, Jack, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers and to be here to the diversity session. Today I just want to start showing you something that I studied at the beginning of my career. This is the last result of our research, me and part of the lab where I was in Sapienza. As you can read, we were a huge group of people, and the final result is this one that you can see. And he looks like a bit like the Italian patriot Garibaldi, but I assure you that we work with archaeologists, anthropologists, and especially with the paleo artists to have this image. But where did it start? So I'm an anthropologist, a bioarchaeologist, and specialize in paleopathology. And what we have are, of course, bones. And what can we ask to the bones? All of this information. And when you have the opportunity to get all this info from a skeleton, I started to ask, okay, let's try to investigate how people with a disability cope in the past. We know today that via the website of the World Health Organization that there is the 15 percentage of the global population that suffers from a form of disability. And so my question was, okay, what happened in the past? How can we cope to not just report a disability, not just report a case study in paleopathology, but just try to have a narrative of that person. So that's why I sent the abstract for diversity, because diversity is also a matter of boundaries, and we are going to see in a few slides what this means today and meant in the past. Disability, of course, can be resumed, or in other ways, the WHO website resumed them in this very articulated way. And of course, these are rules, so we can say these are categories that are nowadays. But what happened in the past? Can we actually use these categories for past population? And then, if we detect someone that needed care in the past, how can we care? How the other members of the community care for this individual? And I really like these two sentences. That the first is, if an individual with a serious impairment lives longer than might be expected, then she or he must have been cared for by the others. And this is very true. And this is even more true, and maybe all of us experienced this during the COVID, that some patients can't be cured, but no patient can't be cared for. And it really applies to the past population and to what we could spot in past communities. But we are here talking also about archaeology. Of course, I have a skeletal collection that, as you know, are human remains from archaeological findings as well. And why the classical period? Well, these are the three main reasons why I decided to dedicate my research to classical and then also to post-classical and the medieval period. We have a bunch of information from the written sources, and we know not only about the pathologies, the medical treatments, but also about the healers, the doctors, or the physicians that acted in past communities. And about the boundaries that I was mentioning before, here's just a quick scheme, but it's quite of impact if we think that, okay, we are in our lab, we have our skeleton in front of us, so the first boundary that is the perception of something that I write on my copybook in this moment because I'm studying the skeleton, and of course the individual that I have on the table. It is just not an individual, and I need the number for the age or the sex or about the stature, but I want to have a life narrative in the end of my research of this individual, especially if there is a pathology that I can detect on the skeleton. So the first boundary from the past is between the person with the impairment and his or her community. So this is the first one. And of course, the second one is with the person itself, or himself or herself, because of course it is a pathology that have occurred during the life, or he or she born with that pathology. So there are all things that you have to keep in mind when you have a skeleton in front of you. And here it's just the last slide with this very quick introduction, where I just want to say that in paleopathology, a case study is fundamental, it's critical, because I can apply new technologies. I can have a very good differential diagnosis, but how much is more difficult to have an osteobiography, so a narrative that uses the same data from the case study, but try to have a life narrative of this person. So this means that we want to shed light to this individual. Okay, this is the case that I want to talk about you today. It's about Servicciola, that some of you maybe already know, and it's a villa, a Roman villa that is 100 kilometers in northern respect to Rome, and it was a villa rustica. Then it was abandoned, and there were an occupation, or I can better say a Longobarд phase. So we are at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 6th century for this individual specifically, but we have still to dating it with radiocarbon dating. But first thing that as an anthropology you have to do is to try to understand the range of age. So I could say that that this individual was between 40 and 50, and the biological sex is a male. And as well, the lab where I was had the opportunity to investigate the diet, and here there is the results are highlighted here, and there are no differences in diet about this individual. The analyses were taken on the bones. This means that in his last 10 years there were no differences in his diet. And as a paleopathologist, I started to look at this skeleton, and now I'm going to show you what I saw on the skeleton. Here there are all the traumas and injuries that I detected on him. So all the red, green, and yellow stars means that they are healed, so totally healed. The blue star means that it is not a heel fracture, but the healing process is still on. So let's have a closer look to them. We have a blunt trauma on the parietal. We have the breakage of the nasal bones, and as well we have the breakage of the right clavicle. And here it's quite evident the shortening of the length of the right one comparing to the left one. And then we can see also the healed body of the right scapula. the piece of bone that you can see for the left scapula in upper right, it is not a pathological condition, it's a genetical one, so it is not related to the case that I want to show you. Then I saw that, I spotted that there were some fractures to the wrist, but not only fractures, I also detected a herniation. A herniation is a pathological condition that happens when two bones run together very closely, and you have this very polished surface. So what you can see is a very, very polished. It's a very polished surface there. And of course, here there is an example of a bone callus. So this is the last slide with bones, and I don't want to be too specific in paleopathology because I would just want to talk about this case from a narrative point of view. But here we can see a taphonomic fracture of the head of the neck of the femur, of his femur. And in a specific point, that is the figure in B, we can detect a very thin layer of bone remodeling. So, of course, part of that fracture is taphonomic, but the other part is not. As in forensics, we know that after 15 days, there are the first layers of new bone formation. So, in this case, we are just a bit more over these 15 days. So, what happened to this individual? I said at the beginning that we could see that we have something healed and something that is not healed, and they are presenting in two different phases of healing. It means that this individual his life occurred two times a very traumatic event, and which was maybe the first one, a fall from a height, example from a ladder, or maybe it was because of the compression of the body. So it's very likely that this kind of trauma are related to work experience. So they are very related to car accident, but of course this is not the case in classical Italy. But when you have to study the clinical impact, so the clinical impact and the clinical reports are very crucial for paleopathologists, because it's something that is related to today, but we have to skip them into the past and see if we can have a comparison among what we have on our table in our lab and what we read in clinical reports. And the first question for a biological of care approach are, okay, this individual needed a short-term, medium-term, or maybe a longer-term care to rehabilitate in the community. And it is very likely that this individual had to face all of these phases, helped, of course, by the community, his community. And what I really like to highlight is that he had a herniation, as I said before, on carpals and metacarpals. What does it mean? That he broke them, because we can see and we can detect a breakage of his wrist, but then he recovered and he was back in the community doing some activities with his hands. And that is very important, because it means that someone that needed care was cared for, and then he was back in the community. And we can detect it as well for the position of his burial in the cemetery of Selvicciola. So the model of care for the first event worked very well. So we can say that he was completely rehabilitated. But what happened after the second traumatic event? This individual fall again, maybe during the rehabilitation, maybe because of our loss of balance. What's happened is that in these cases, from the clinical reports, you have to lay, just rest and wait. This means that okay, now today is quite easy. So if I am on my bed, I say, okay, can I have a glass of water? Maybe someone can take me take to me the glass of water. But in a past community, maybe where the water is not present in my village, or I have to move, or I have to grab something to eat for you. So it's a very huge. It's a very huge thing to care for someone. And this time, what is true is that the short term, we can detect the short term care. We can detect maybe the medium term of care, because maybe we have some weeks after the breakage of the neck of the femur. But what happened then? Maybe we can imagine that this individual fall again, and there are many veins and arterias, and a blood shock is very likely that can happen in these cases. And in this case, we can say that the polished part that we saw on the neck of the femur, as well as the part of the new bone formation, can tell us that this individual survived. So his community helped him in the first phases after the traumatic event, but in this case it didn't work. But what can we say from the writing sources, about the writing sources? We know that the Romans were very, very practical with putting in order in repairing broken bones. So we know that from written sources, and here there is just a little part from the Medicina by Aulo Cornelio Celso. And we have here then also a representation of a tool that was used, of course, many centuries later, but they are based on a technique used by the Romans. And then we can spot how the Romans were on the medical treatments, also with the archaeological findings. And here we can see some instruments and tools that were used that are a bit of horrifying if you look at them now, but they worked because people survived. And how we can know that? I really like this image because it's from the Trajan column, and here we can spot a physician that is taking care for a soldier. So we know that the Romans were, well, they expanded their boundaries a lot, and the engine, their power, were the soldiers. Why they were the soldiers? Because they were in the fight, they broke their arms, their legs, and then they were the physician. They put in order the break, and the soldiers were ready again to go back in the battle. So that is a very important, okay, this is not a huge help, but it is very important to keep in mind also the importance of the environment and of the medical traditions around the case study that you are looking at. So about this case study and his Osteobiography, what we can see. The first thing that I have to confess you is that I show you what I saw on the skeleton, but for an anthropologist or paleopathologist, is also important what is not present on the skeleton. So there are no lesions related to nutritional problems. So what we know is that during his childhood, he grew very well, without problems. He reached the adulthood because his stature is in the average of the rest of the community. So what happened then? He had the opportunity to have the same diet. So he had water, the same water, the amount of cereals, the amounts of meat, just like the others of the community, and we could detect it with the isotopes. And then we know that maybe we don't know if for certain there was a physician in the community of Servicciola, but what we know for certain is that someone were able to look at those traumas, those injuries, and that he then survived. So we can say that we shed light, a bit of light on this life, and we get in the end a life narrative from this individual. And that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ileana. For our second paper, we are welcoming Giulia Saltini Semerari. She is the assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and assistant curator in the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She arrived in Michigan after one postdoc in Amsterdam and one in Tübingen, and a PhD at the University of Oxford. Her main research interest is Mediterranean connectivity in the early first millennium BC, with a focus on the central Mediterranean. To address this, she conducted an international collaborative project, Amici, applying a spectrum of bioarchaeological and archaeological analyses to indigenous and early colonial cemeteries in southern Italy. A new project on Adriatic connectivity is set to start in 2023. She is also the vice director of the field school at the indigenous Greek site of Incoronata in southern Italy, where she is responsible for metal finds and textile tools. A second research interest is the archaeology of gender, and she has recently co-organized a new research initiative on gender in the early Iron Age Mediterranean.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. Yes, it works. So, hello everyone. Being the last one to be speaking today, first of all, I will try to be synthetic, and second of all, I really wanted to thank the organizer of the conference for their great hospitality and for having us here, but also I wanted to really thank the other speakers of the conference for all the food for thought that they have given me and all of us. So it's quite a feat now to be the last one in the conference, but thank you all. That has been really amazing. So today I'm going to try to condense in a very short period of time what the state of gender archaeology is in the Mediterranean. And so I hope that you will be kind with me on not being too specific and not getting too much into details. It will be completely impossible to actually do justice in detail to the whole field, but I'll try to sort of outline the general trends that we can see. And I'm speaking not only for myself, but for my two colleagues and partners in crime in this case, Meritzell Ferrer from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and Mireia Lopez-Bertran, who is at the University of Valencia. So as Eva said, I'll try to channel them as well into this talk. So in order to start, I will have to give you just a brief introduction of what I think the key elements of gender archaeology really are, so that we can see how and whether they have been applied into Mediterranean archaeology, and then we'll briefly discuss what I think the limits are of these current applications, and hopefully like a final case study that will point to, I hope, the way forward. So if I had to really define what gender archaeology is, first of all, it was born out of the 70s and second wave feminism, and at the time it had three main components and concerns that are still really relevant to the discipline and what it's trying to achieve. And these are, first of all, the deconstruction of androcentric bias in the reconstruction of the past. And this came from a recognition that in the 70s, much of history, human history and archaeology had been written by adult white men, and that was a little bit myopic and was not really doing justice to the contribution of other genders in all of their intersections in the past. And also it kept pushing back current gender stereotypes, like the fact that there always was just a binary, or that there always was a hierarchy of genders with women naturally subordinated to men, or a specific division of labors, men go hunting, women stay home with the children, for example. And correlated to that, obviously, was the positive attempts to reconstruct a history that included other gendered identities in all of their intersections, and this has been an ongoing project, which, with time, in the last 40 years, has also included a variety of different perspectives, theories, but has maintained that as kind of one of its key goals, which could be summarized in the following sentence: you cannot really understand the past unless you really include everyone. And then, of course, there has been, because this was born out of a political movement that was very much grounded in the present, a critical attention to the practices of the discipline, with debates about hopefully finding, and this is Alison Wiley's very important work, new and better and less hierarchical and more equitable ways of constructing our practices of knowledge construction. So I will get back to these points and look at how have they been developed within Mediterranean archaeology in the last 40 years. But before I do that, I just wanted to highlight this particular paper, because this is arguably the paper that really kick-started, though it was not the first one, gender archaeology, and which was at the beginning very much an enterprise of Northern Europe and North America. So the Mediterranean was out of it, and it has had a lot of catch-up work to do. But this particular article by Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector is still a pleasure to read, and it really outlines in remarkable clarity all of the things that I just talked to you about. One part that I would like to highlight for you today, because I think it's relevant for the continuing of our discussion, is the following. So assuming that we will be able to establish some meaningful correlation between the material and non-material aspect of gender systems, we may then be in a methodological position to use the archaeological record to examine long-term evolutionary patterns and processes concerning gender. And of course, we're talking about the early 80s. Processional archaeology was very, very central to this project. But the final point is also, I think, very important also for current archaeology, which is at the same time, this kind of research will lead to better understandings of the role of gender arrangements and ideology in structuring or affecting other processes of change. So how gender really intersects with diachronic processes of social change. Please keep that in mind as we continue in our conversation, because I will get back to it. So, how is the state of the field in gender archaeology in the Mediterranean? Again, I apologize for the extreme synthesis of this attempt. But let me get back to those original 3 points. When it comes to the deconstruction, so of stereotypical biased, like the taking of stereotypical ideas of gender, which are obviously inherently biased, and pushing them back into our interpretation of the past, the constructive part is somewhat lacking still in gender archaeology, I think, and this will be one of the recurrent themes of my talk, because Mediterranean archaeology has not really taken advantage of the full spectrum of theories and perspectives and in-depth reflections that gender archaeology elsewhere has produced. So this part has not been very much at the forefront of our conversations. The one interesting exception, I think, is looking at particularly the expression of gender binaries or non-binaries within the most ancient part of Mediterranean history, so the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. The Neolithic, John Robb has recently published an interesting, although I'm not sure I agree with him, paper, and then there are some interesting works on Minoan iconography, for example. And I have the feeling that the reason for this, why this is happening, is that those periods are in some ways distant enough from the classical Mediterranean for not eliciting too much discomfort in discussing these things, but also it has to do probably with the structure of sources themselves, so there is no written sources that we can draw from, but there is quite a bit of interesting iconographic evidence that people can be based on. And we'll get back to this question of like, what sources do we use for gender archaeology further down in the discussion. One of the second aspects that has that gender archaeology in the Mediterranean are missed, but it is a pity because there is quite a bit of potential there, is a deconstruction of this idea of gender hierarchies, so that there is an inherent natural hierarchy where women are subordinated by men. In gender archaeology elsewhere, these discussions had entered into very interesting debates about the nature of power and heterarchy, and this has been not picked up, and it's a shame particularly when it comes to early Iron Age archaeology, because there is quite a bit of potential there is in actually investigating how power is constructed differently in that period. But because of this lack of theorization, this hasn't been done nearly enough. And I will talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. Getting to the other part, other element of gender archaeology, which is the active reconstruction of more inclusive narratives that include everyone. I will never have time to actually talk about all the really good work that has been done in Mediterranean archaeology. So I don't just want to rant. I also want to explicitly say that the people that have assessed and studied gender in Mediterranean archaeology in the last 40 years have often done a really good job. So the works are interesting, are varied in their perspectives and in the kind of material cultures that they have used. But there are some persistent problems that I would like to address today about this work. So one is the fact that most of the people that have done this job are women, and that a lot of the work itself, with very few illuminated exceptions, and thank you, Lynn Foxall, for that, is really based on women and children. And I'm sorry to say that because masculinity is indeed still also a gender, but people seem to forget that. And so this kind of works, although methodologically, theoretically very interesting, seems to still be a little bit stuck in the remedial phase of archaeology, where we're just trying still to figure out what the women are doing on the side while the men are really doing the historical diachronic changes and processes. And the other point, I think, that is also interesting but problematic in this is that different parts and subdisciplines and chronologies of the broader Mediterranean archaeologies have actually investigated issues of genders looking at different sources. So there is a tendency of different subdisciplines to agglutinate around specific kinds of sources. For example, the early Iron Age, not a lot of iconography, not a lot of written sources. We look at burials, and that's all we do, mostly, with some few exceptions. But then people that have studied and have tried to study gender in the more like classical Greece and Roman framework have really used a lot of literary sources and iconography, but underuse archaeology in this context. Phoenician archaeology is something even different, where iconography is used a lot because there is a lot of that, and archaeology somewhat, but particularly in domestic context. And the problem with this is that that doesn't help comparing these kind of processes across discipline. It doesn't help our communication with each other. Another problem, of course, linked to the difficulties of comparing and communicating is that even if there are a lot of interesting work that are being done, it's still very niche. So gender as an analytical category that is integrated in our normal study of historical processes, we're still really not there. It's still just a thing that a few women do, which means there's not a lot of us, and we kind of exist in isolated spaces in that sense. So, okay. When it comes to the practice and critical addressing sort of how we critically do discipline, how our disciplinary practice work. I think here there is a little bit of difference between archaeologists that do archaeology of the Mediterranean by traveling there once a year and then going back, and the archaeologists that are actually in the Mediterranean doing the research. And particularly for the latter, there has not been a lot, or I can say there has been a lagging behind in like a critical discourse about disciplinary practice, particularly with references to sexual discrimination and sexual harassment. And I think that part of the problem is the very hierarchical structure of the academy in general, but particularly Mediterranean countries, and the fact that a lot of people's career depends on their senior mentors. And so this certainly hinders a certain level of open discourse about these matters, which is what we should be doing according to the tenets of gender archaeology. So a lack of critical reflection has also then led to a lack of attempts and reflection on actually finding new ways of creating knowledge that are more open and more inclusive and more equitable and less hierarchical. So this is not really happening now, but we really, really should try to make it happen. And I'll go back to that in a second. So to summarize the state of the field sort of background part of my talk, there are some limits that really prevent us from harnessing all the interpretative potential that gender archaeology actually gives us to understand the past, and use it to really understand the very rich and full archaeological, material, cultural evidence that we have in the Mediterranean. And these are both methodological and theoretical. On the methodological side, as I was saying, there is a persistent fragmentation of approaches, which makes gender archaeology in the Mediterranean look less like a field. And indeed, there is no conference about gender archaeology in the Mediterranean that exists, and more like a constellation of isolated efforts that exist but really don't communicate enough with each other. And then, of course, as I was saying just a second ago, there is a lack of reflection on disciplinary practice and how to actually make them better. On the theoretical part of the issue, and obviously all these things are sort of connected to each other, there is still the problem of not using genders as a category as often as we should as a category of analysis in our historical reconstruction, which ends up creating narratives of faceless blobs, as Rodriguez would call them, producing change in the course of history. But this also has two important consequences, one of which is if we don't deal explicitly with this process, we end up still perpetuating the implicit assumptions that it's only men that are agents in historical diachronic change. And the other one is our difficulty in trying to get out of the remedial phase of studying women in this context also means that we have this persistent problem that we really don't know how to integrate the gender in real reconstruction of diachronic historical social change within local communities in the Mediterranean. And this is incidentally a problem of Mediterranean archaeology, but it's a failure of full theorization also for gender archaeology in general, with the exception of modern colonialist archaeology, but that's kind of hard to apply to when we go back to the Mediterranean deep past. Okay, so one of the things that I would like to say today is that really, this is really a pity, because the Mediterranean itself offers some incredibly interesting, potentially interesting case studies and a lot of rich resources to actually not only address these limits, but make active contribution to our understanding of gender in the past and to gender archaeology as a discipline more broadly. And here I'm going to suggest one main theoretical, methodological point that I think we can address, and in so doing, making this contribution. And this is the relationship and the intersection between issues of connectivity and issues of gender dynamics. So this is a Mediterranean Archaeology conference. Connectivity is at the heart of what you do. Even if we're now understanding in more nuanced terms, and we're looking at different aspects, and we're looking also at connectivity inland and towards like interior parts and rural parts of the Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean conference. Of course, we're talking about connectivity. It's the Mediterranean that is connecting all of us. And it still lies at the heart of a lot of the work that archaeologists do to understand diachronic changes within the Mediterranean. At the same time, there is a stark under-theorizing of how connectivity intersects with gender dynamics, but every connection, every instance of mobility, every instance of interaction, every instance of migration entails automatically issues of gender. These are all dynamics that happen that are declined within questions of gender. And the only person that I know that has written a little bit about is Marie-Louise Sorensen in her book, Chapter 7, where she says, okay, if we understand gender as a negotiation of rights, obligations, and needs, then if some new resources arrive, if some new social connections arrive, if something disturbs this negotiation, then these new things are taken into account to renegotiate the entire system. And this is perhaps a very hyper-systematic way of looking at this issue. We can also look at from a much more basic perspective, thinking when people move, whether it's a migration, whether it's exchange, whether it's gift giving, whatever, like all the things that people are doing in the Mediterranean. Who is moving? Is that adult men? Is it families? And what is the demographic profile of the people that are leaving behind? And what is then the social impact of this movement on both kinds of populations? Those are moving, that are left behind. And then once they encounter new people, what happens to their gendered expectations if they're different? And how do they interact? How do we find better, more nuanced way of thinking about intermarriage and the exchange of resources, and how all these kinds of connectivities and movement actually also change the structure of kinship, which is fundamental for our understanding of how society works. So gender is always implicated in connectivity, but we really don't talk about that. And so we should. Okay, so to get to the sort of more constructive part of my talk, here I just wanted to outline one attempt. Yes, I know the name is weird because this is what you get when you brainstorm name for projects. After the EA in Budapest and obviously one too many glasses of Palinka, but it stuck. And so now we're stuck, we have this name. So I'm gonna just talk to you in the next 3 slides about a project that we are starting and that we hope will, with action and not just talking about it, address some of this limitation and push our discipline a little bit forward on this theme, let's say. So the Gendyterranean group, I don't know, it's an initiative, it's a research group, it's a project, it's all of those 3 things put together, but it's focused on one particular Mediterranean case study, which is, however, very broad because it's Mediterranean-wide, and it's the transition between the early Iron Age and the classical period. So it's a critical moment in the Mediterranean, lots of things happen. There is a general trend towards a greater hierarchization of communities. There are some instances of ethnogenesis, a move towards urbanization or semi-urbanization or kind of things in between. And here is just a kind of obvious illustration of the pre and post of this process in the most visual way that I could find. But also, so it's a moment of historical change, which is what we're interested in. At the same time, it's catalyzed by increasing connectivity within the Mediterranean. So it calls into question the second thing that I was talking about. So how do we actually address connectivity and gender? In particular, but connectivity that has many shapes, but in particular and importantly, the migration of peoples from the Levant and the Aegean to the other coasts of the Mediterranean, which also brings to like very intense instances of cultural contact and change to local communities all across the Mediterranean. And so to address these gigantic issues, what essentially we're asking is, how did gender dynamics of local Mediterranean population were affected by this global Mediterranean change, but also how did long-term early Iron Age gender structures that were there shaped at the local level how these global Mediterranean changes actually took shape there. So it's a question of both comparability and understanding variabilities and similarities at the same time. And one of the advantages that we have is that because this transition is important for Mediterranean history, lots of people have been studying it, none has asked questions about gender explicitly. Well, not is not entirely fair, but and so we have a lot of materials to work from, and we are doing that by doing a collaborative effort based on like comparing different areas of the Mediterranean. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that there is compelling evidence that this transition has had an effect on gender structure locally across the Mediterranean. And this is another good example of why our field is, of the fact that our field is fragmented and isolated. All these different bits and hints of the fact that there is stuff that is happening that is interesting have never dialogued with each other. So there is, I can give you a couple of examples. I could give you many, but I'm not going to do it because I don't have time. So for example, there is an article by Ian Morris in '98 who said, maybe there is a relationship between these changing plans of domestic structures in Greece where as they add rooms, women can be more segregated. I'm not sure that this is current right now, but he was the first to attempt to connect changes in like gender dynamic and broader historical changes at the same time. Another example would be Maria Assunta Quazzo's Ponte Cagnano necropolis studies, which is an amazing study of 7th century elite competition in Campania, where she demonstrated that gender is directly implicated in these patterns of elite competition. So even within the same site, 2 different computer nuclei of necropolis show different organizations in terms of gender. And then one last example, because I think it's particularly relevant, is Margarita Gleba's work on textiles, who really showed that Italy and Greece belong to completely different technological traditions during the early Iron Age. But starting from the Greek colonization and onwards, Italy starts adopted the Greek technology of textile production to a certain extent. And this really begs the question of who was moving and how and who were they interacting with? Because we know in the early Iron Age, textile production was mainly in the hands of women. So in our mind, we always think of Greeks being Greek men moving from the Aegean to Italy, but maybe this was not exactly the case. And this is where more details and more attention to these kind of questions, it's really needed to understand things better. And then, so to finish my talk, the other thing that we're explicitly doing is we're really trying to make this an experiment in creating a better collaborative practices that are more equitable, that are more open, that are less hierarchical. So it's a collaborative effort. Hopefully it is expansive. Our hope is that it will also help train and mentor in the future more students that are interested in this question. So pedagogy is also very important. But it's also decentralized. So we recognize this is a huge question. We cannot answer it in a book. What we're hoping to do is to stay together for a long time, and each of us can propose one theme, one aspect that we want to get into depth with, and whoever else wants to participate with their own regional expertise can. And depending on how many people we are, we can create different outputs. It's 2 people, we can do an article, it's 10, we can do a conference, we'll see. But it's a democratic effort. And hopefully, the other thing that I'd like this to become is that it is a group for peer support. So whatever output we have, everyone else can give advice on before, during, and after our production. And this is just a group of us, the group of expanded in the middle bit, but those are the people responsible for the name. So, so to conclude, thank you very much to all. The state of gender archaeology in the Mediterranean is so-so, but I think we can really make it better altogether.
Thank you, Giulia and Ileana. And we will now take a few questions for both of our speakers. Can you turn that one off?
I have.
Is it off?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can take it off.
Okay. Okay. You can pass it on.
Yeah, thank you. Those were great. Julia, I was wondering, so one of the things that I really like Sorensen's work too, particularly, and it's in dialogue with a lot of Strather and stuff on relations, and this idea of being able to use, like, approach even a text sort of archaeologically if you focus on the materiality of how things are negotiated. But where I run into, like, problems, I think, with Sorensen and generally, like, broader approaches is that they seem to always assume a certain kind of individual exists and that there's a certain way of constituting, like, an anatomically sexed body such that it is bounded in the same way to, like, its socialization, and that when you have a lot of different groups who the approaches are fragmented because we do have, it's partially preservation and I think partially how things are recorded, we can't necessarily, I don't always feel confident, even when we do have evidence like in Egypt, but in other places where we don't, that we have that kind of individual, like, possession of identity and experience. And so when you look at these kinds of connections, I guess my question is, how do you reckon with trying to make comparable these very disparate, possibly sort of almost incommensurate ways of conceptualizing who a person is and how their identity is constituted?
This is a really good question, and one that I don't have an answer to. But I also think, okay, so I think it's relevant to different moments, probably, of Mediterranean history. I have the feeling that within, particularly like in the early Iron Age, and going forward within the Mediterranean, there is some level of mutual intelligibility that is borne out this long history of perhaps sporadic, but nonetheless like communication and non-isolation. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic in that sense, because we know that they manage to interact with each other. And so we can probably address that by studying how they interacted. But also my hope is that, because none of us is going to, but when I say yes, I'm like, anyone is welcome. But it's going to analyze all of the areas, but each of us has an area where we're more confident, where we've been working, then each of us can speak to how that works for their area and how identity might have been constructed then, and then we can have a dialogue comparing the two areas. Comparability is an issue that we have no matter what. Certainly, like trying to address similar problems with similar sources will go. I think we're way far. How do you say it? We're far away from like getting to that level of sophistication in our analysis. Even just like being able to say, okay, we're looking at similar sources and this is the pattern, would be a success. But down the line, definitely it's something that it will be good to reason on.
Thank you, both of our speakers. Those were both fantastic. My question is for Ileana, and I found your case study very compelling as evidence of sort of short-term disability care and rehabilitation, and I'm wondering in your data set if there's also evidence for longer-term disability or chronic illness care and rehabilitation.
Yeah, the first case, the one that looks like the Patriot, the Italian Patriot, is an amputation of the forearm, and of course he had no more his right arm, and that in that case, the community has to look at this individual at the beginning, and then of course during the course of his life. What does it mean? That this individual was able to have a normal life. Of course, he had to be helped by the others, and maybe he could no more be one of the warriors of the community. Maybe he could not be fully active during the agricultural activities, but as well he had a role in the community, because it was buried into the cemetery, and he lived longer after the amputation. So we can imagine this life went well. But this is a good question, because if you relate to case studies, you can see, okay, in this community I know this person, but it is also about aging, because aging means that you are not fully you can't maybe be fully active during the agricultural works, and maybe you need more help for moving, or maybe you need that someone bring you food and water. So it is also a class of, we can say, of people in various communities. And the new boundaries, just to make it the reply more complex. Now the new boundary is to look at people with the same disability, the same impairment in a community, and see how the members face these impairments.
Thank you. I have another question for Giulia, and also building on something that Leah was mentioning. I want to draw back on one of the overarching issues that we've had throughout the conference. And I know that this was a very fast overview of the whole issue, which is extremely complex, but there are so many authors in the Mediterranean authors, feminist and gender archaeologists who have been working on these issues that never seem to make it to Anglophone spheres of debate and scholarly cycles. So I know the Spanish context very well, so I guess Meritzell and you have also worked with, there's just so many scholars, Almudena in Madrid, Sandra Monton in Barcelona, and in Granada, Marga Romero, who have worked on specific issues of just individualistic agencies and identities versus collective agencies and identities in the context of archaeological thinking. But I'm just wondering, because just out of all the titles that we've seen and the many more that are lacking, we still bring up the same authors over and over again whenever we're debating in like Anglophone forums. And I just wonder what you think could be a good path to bring relevance to these authors that keep being not inaccessible, but not accessed in a more, I don't know.
Yes, and you're right. This is my fault because I wanted to put one of their books up, but I was in a hurry and I just reverted to what I had read, which is a sign of the fact that we need to do better. Absolutely. And yes, so one of the things that I would have liked to have the time to mention is that, in fact, Spanish, currently in Spain and Portugal, the scholarship on gender is some of the most interesting that's coming out in the Mediterranean, and they're doing amazing work. I wish that Meritzell and Mireia would be here, but I don't know that there is necessarily a solution. I think what they've been doing has in some ways worked because they are at many of these international conferences. That's how we met. I met them because we were on all the gender panels of the EAA repetitively every year, and so we just got drunk together. So in some ways, I don't think that they need to be rescued in any way. They're doing their job and they're amazing, and they are present in the discourse, absolutely. I think going back to themes that we developed in the course of this conference, so both going back to what Elizabeth was saying, but also Eva, there is the language issue, which resonates strangely to me because I grew up in Italy, and when I started classical archaeology, I was told you need to be able to read and write every major European language, and that's it. There is no discussion about this. Like, if you want to be one of us, that's the... So yes, language and collaboration. So like this is one of the other things that we're trying to create is a group that crosses different boundaries, whether they're of the areas that we're working on in the Mediterranean, but also where we're working directly. And all of these things will hopefully bring the cause forward.
All right, I'm going to thank both of our speakers. I have a lot of questions, but I won't ask them. And I suggest you do what I will do, corner them during our coffee break. So we will break for 15 minutes, and then we will conclude our conference.